The gymnasium smelled like industrial cleaner and birthday cake, and somehow that combination made everything worse. It was supposed to be a celebration, streamers in yellow and green, Poppy's favorite colors, hung from the basketball hoops in careful loops. Folding tables had been covered with white paper tablecloths, anchored at the corners with tape because the hall got drafty. Someone had ordered 3 dozen cupcakes from the bakery, on Elgin Street, the nice one, and arranged them on a tiered stand in the center of the main table. A banner above the stage read Happy 9th Birthday in block letters, each one outlined in glitter. The kind of banner you ordered online at midnight when you were trying very hard to make something feel special. Poppy Whitmore sat in her wheelchair beside that tower, and had not touched a single one. She had her hands in her lap, fingers loosely folded, the way she'd learned to hold them, when she was trying not to show that something hurt. She was watching the other children, her classmates from Hillcrest Elementary, 34 of them, playing a relay game at the far end of the gym, running, laughing, sliding on the polished floor in their socks. One girl, Maya, kept shrieking every time she dropped the beanbag. The sound bounced off the walls and came back louder. Poppy watched and said nothing. She had stopped trying to get anyone's attention about 20 minutes ago. Not because anyone had been cruel to her, nobody had, that was almost the harder part, they'd just drifted. The way water finds its own level, the other children had naturally flowed toward the games, toward the noise, toward the things they could do with their bodies that Poppy could no longer do with hers. No malice. No moment anyone could point to. Just the slow, quiet arithmetic of exclusion, and by the time the relay race started, Poppy was alone at the birthday table, next to her own cake, in her own wheelchair, at her own party. Across the gymnasium her father was on his phone. Raymond Whitmore stood near the exit doors, with his back half turned to the room, one hand pressed to his ear, nodding at something the person on the other end was saying. He was 41 years old, the Deputy Director of Infrastructure Planning for the City of Ottawa, and there was a situation developing with a contractor on the Queensway expansion. Something about a permit that had been filed incorrectly. And it needed to be dealt with before Monday, and the only person who could authorize the correction was Raymond. And the contractor's project manager had been calling since Thursday. He kept glancing at Poppy, he kept telling himself he'd be done in 2 more minutes. He had been telling himself that for 25 minutes. To understand what this moment cost Poppy Whitmore, you need to know what her life looked like before the accident. Not to make the contrast more dramatic, though it was, but because Poppy herself still lived in that before life in her memory. The way some people live in a house they've had to leave. Able to describe every room with perfect clarity, knowing the feel of the light at different hours. Still reaching for light switches that aren't there anymore. Before Poppy had been a runner. Not organized track, not yet, she was only 7 at the time. But the kind of child who ran everywhere simply because walking felt like a waste. She ran to the school bus. She ran down the hall at her grandmother's house in Sudbury, socked feet sliding on the hardwood, arms out for balance. She ran across the soccer field at McNabb Park on Saturday mornings, her dark hair streaming behind her, laughing at nothing in particular, just at the sheer fact of her own speed. She was also, her father would tell you, the child who noticed things. The kid who asked why the neighbor's cat sat in the same window every afternoon, and then went and asked the neighbor about it, and came back with a full report. His name was Cosmo, he was 14, he had arthritis, and the afternoon sun on that particular window ledge was the warmest spot in the apartment. Poppy collected information about the world with the same appetite other children reserved for snacks. She was curious in a way that was almost aggressive. She had opinions about clouds. Raymond and his wife, Susan, used to joke that Poppy would either be a journalist or a civil liberties lawyer. They couldn't decide which would be more exhausting. Susan died 11 months before the accident. Ovarian cancer, fast-moving, diagnosed in February and gone by September. Poppy was 6. Raymond was 38, and had never felt so completely unequipped for anything in his life, as he did standing in a hospital room in the Civic, saying goodbye to a woman who, until 6 months earlier, had seemed invincible. He did what people in his position do. He worked. He made lunches. He showed up to school concerts and parent-teacher interviews and Saturday soccer. He got Poppy to grief counseling every other Thursday. And sometimes he even went himself, though he spent most of those sessions talking about logistics rather than feelings, which his counselor, a patient man named Dr. Nwosu, observed without judgment and waited for Raymond to figure out on his own. Then, 14 months after Susan died, Raymond drove Poppy home from a birthday party on a Wednesday evening in November. The roads were clear, he was not speeding, he had done nothing wrong. A transport truck ran a red light on Carling Avenue and hit the passenger side of Raymond's Subaru with enough force to push them 20 feet into the intersection. Raymond walked away with a fractured wrist and 4 broken ribs. Poppy did not walk away at all. The spinal injury was at the T6 level, thoracic, mid-back, and while the surgeons were careful to explain that such injuries exist on a spectrum, that outcomes vary, that rehabilitation is a long road, and science does not always have fixed answers, the practical reality that settled into Raymond's life over the following months was this. His daughter, who had run everywhere simply because walking felt like a waste, now could not walk at all. He blamed himself, of course he did. The truck had hit her side. He had been driving. These were the facts Raymond's mind returned to every morning at 4 a.m. with the reliability of a commuter train. He knew, intellectually, that fault was not his. The investigation was clear. The truck driver had been awake for 22 hours, and had run the light without braking. Raymond had done everything right. Knowing this did not help. What it did, instead, was make him pour everything into solutions. Into fixing what could be fixed, providing what could be provided. They moved to a house in Westboro with wider doorways and a main floor bedroom, already modified by a previous owner. He researched wheelchair models with the thoroughness he brought to infrastructure reports. He hired an occupational therapist and a physiotherapist, and kept meticulous notes from every appointment. He advocated loudly at the school board, until Hillcrest hired an educational assistant trained in mobility support. He arranged, booked, planned, and executed. He was extremely good at all of it. What he had not yet figured out, what Dr. Nwosu had tried to raise twice, and Raymond had redirected both times, was how to simply be present, how to sit with Poppy without a task in hand, how to put the phone down. He was working on it. He just hadn't gotten there yet. He had thought the birthday party would be easier than it was turning out to be. He'd rented the gymnasium at the Hintonburg Community Center, which was fully accessible. He'd confirmed the cupcakes were nut-free, and checked twice. He'd sent home paper invitations and digital ones, and 34 children had said they were coming, and 34 had come, and Raymond had thought that meant success. He hadn't accounted for the relay race. He hadn't thought through what 34 9-year-olds would naturally gravitate toward, in a gymnasium, with a long, open floor. He hadn't considered that even the most well-meaning children, when given the option of running versus sitting beside a girl in a wheelchair, would choose running, not out of cruelty, but out of instinct, and that the effect on Poppy would be identical either way. He was still on the phone when the man walked in. Stuart Bellemare arrived 12 minutes late because his son, Finn, had lost one of his shoes. Not misplaced, actually lost. As in, they checked everywhere, and the shoe was simply gone, which is a thing that happens with 7-year-olds, more often than anyone ever warns you about. Stuart found it eventually behind the radiator in the upstairs hallway, which raised more questions than it answered. And by the time they got to the community center and signed in at the desk, and found the right gymnasium, the party had clearly been going for a while. Stuart Bellemare was 39 years old. He worked as an occupational therapist at the Bruyere Rehabilitation Center on Bruyere Street, which he always found mildly amusing to tell people, because they assumed he was making it up. He lived in Vanier with Finn and a cat named Poutine, who was not named by Stuart, and whom Stuart privately found exhausting. He was widowed. Finn's mother, Celine, had died 2 years earlier from a brain aneurysm at 33, no warning, no time, here one morning, gone by afternoon. Stuart had held Finn, who was 5, and explained what had happened in the simplest words he had, and then, he had driven to his mother's house in Gatineau, and sat in her kitchen for 4 hours without speaking, and she had made him tea 3 times, and not asked him anything, and he had never once in his life been more grateful for silence. He had not fully recovered. He wasn't sure he was supposed to. He had learned, through his work and through the particular education of grief, that recovery was the wrong word for what happened to people after loss. What happened was more like accommodation. Your life changed shape around the absence, you learned to carry it differently. He was good at his job, because he understood this. When patients at Bruyere despaired that they would never return to who they had been, Stuart did not offer false comfort. He said that the person they had been was not lost, only changed, that the life ahead was different, not lesser, and that the distance between those two words was everything. Some of his patients told him he'd saved their lives. He always said they'd done the saving themselves. He meant it. He stood at the entrance to the gymnasium with Finn's hand in his, and looked at the room. It took him about 4 seconds, long professional habit, the relay race at the far end, the cluster of children, the empty tables near the cupcake display, and at the center table, beside the tiered stand, a small girl in a wheelchair, with her hands in her lap, and her face turned toward the noise at the far end of the room. With the particular expression Stuart knew better than almost any other. The expression of someone who has decided that wanting to be included is more painful than not wanting it, and is in the process of dismantling the wanting. He had seen that expression on adults, who had been in rehabilitation for months. He had seen it on teenagers. He had not expected to see it on a 9-year-old at her own birthday party, but here it was. Finn tugged at his hand. "Dad, cupcakes." "Yeah bud," Stuart said. "Let's go say hi first." Finn accepted this without complaint. He was a fairly adaptable child, which Stuart attributed largely to Céline, who had been the most adaptable person he'd ever known. They walked across the gymnasium. Poppy didn't notice them until they were close. She'd been watching the relay race, tracking the beanbag as it moved from hand to hand. When she finally looked up, her expression did what expressions do when someone has been bracing for a long time and is startled out of it. A flicker of confusion, then a kind of careful neutrality, the armor reassembling itself. Stuart crouched down so he was at her level. This was automatic for him, something he'd learned early in his career and never unlearned. You don't stand over people in chairs, you meet them where they are. "Hey," he said, "I'm Stuart, this is Finn, he's in your class I think, we're very sorry we're late." He lost his shoe. Finn, prompted by nothing, held up the shoe in question. It was a blue running shoe, slightly dusty from the radiator area. "It was behind the heater," he said, with the gravity of someone reporting a significant discovery. Poppy looked at the shoe. Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile yet, but the territory just before one. "How?" she said. "We don't know," Stuart said. "We've decided not to investigate further." She looked at him for a moment, then quietly, "I'm Poppy, happy birthday Poppy," Stuart said. "Is this seat taken?" She shook her head. Stuart pulled out a chair for himself and one for Finn, and they sat down beside her, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Which it was, of course, but sometimes the most ordinary things are the ones that matter most. Finn immediately began talking about the cupcakes, which led to a discussion about whether vanilla or chocolate was the superior frosting. And this turned out to be a subject on which Poppy had strong and well-reasoned opinions. Stuart listened to her make her case for chocolate. Something about depth of flavor, and the fact that vanilla was technically a default. And he thought that this was a child who, under different circumstances, was absolutely going to be formidable. He asked about the banner. She told him her dad had ordered it online. She said it with a certain careful flatness, that told him everything he needed to know about the banner, and the planning that had gone into this party, and the gap between what had been intended and what had landed. He asked what grade she was in. He asked what she liked best about school. He asked, carefully and without any particular emphasis, whether she liked the community center, or if she'd been here before. He was not conducting an assessment, he was just talking. But 20 years of working with people whose sense of self had been disrupted by circumstances beyond their control, had given Stuart the instinct for which questions opened doors and which ones closed them, and he asked only the opening kind. Poppy talked, slowly at first, then more. She told him about her teacher, Mr. Favreau, who did different voices for every character when he read aloud. She told him that her favorite subject was actually social studies, because she liked maps. She told him, unprompted, that she used to run, and that she was working with a physiotherapist to learn to transfer from her chair to different surfaces, and that she'd recently managed to get from her chair to the floor and back up again on her own, and that it had taken her 3 weeks to learn how, and she was very proud of it. "You should be," Stuart said simply. That's genuinely hard. She looked at him. Most people say that's amazing, like they can't believe it. It is amazing, he said. But it's also just hard work paying off. That's allowed to just be what it is. She thought about this. Finn, who had been quietly eating a cupcake with vanilla frosting, a small act of cupcake apostasy that Poppy had noted and let pass, looked up and said, "My dad does the same thing at work, helps people learn stuff again." "Finn," Stuart said. "What? You do?" Poppy looked at Stuart. "What do you do?" He told her. "Occupational therapist, Bruyere, mostly working with adults who'd had strokes or injuries." He said it plainly, without the careful bright tone people sometimes used around disability, as if the topic required special handling. It didn't. It was just his job. Poppy nodded like she was filing this information. Then she said, "Do you think I could learn to play that game?" She nodded toward the relay race at the far end of the gym. Stuart looked at it for a moment. He took in the layout, the two lines of children, the beanbag being passed from the front to the back between the legs, the turning and handing off at the ends. He thought about it the way he thought about problems at work. Not whether but how. "Yes," he said, "you'd need a different version, but yeah, actually, can I show you something?" He stood up and walked over to the group of children running the relay. He waited for a natural pause. When one team finished a round and the kids were reorganizing, and then he introduced himself as Finn's dad and asked if they could try something new. He explained, in clear and uncomplicated terms, a variation he'd seen used in adaptive recreation programs. Instead of a relay that required running, a passing chain, where players formed a line, alternating seat and standing, and the goal was to move an object along the chain using only certain passes, no direct handing allowed. It was actually harder than the original game. There was strategy involved. You had to think. The children were interested. Children are almost always more interested in novelty than adults expect them to be. Within 5 minutes, the game had reorganized itself around the new rules, and Poppy was at one end of the line, receiving the beanbag from a boy named Dylan, and passing it overhead to a girl standing behind her. She had to twist slightly to do it, and Stuart watched her figure out the angle, and when she made the first successful pass, the girl behind her cheered, and Poppy laughed. Not the polite, careful sound she had made earlier in the conversation, but a real laugh, sharp and bright, the kind that comes out when something is genuinely funny, or genuinely good, and there is no time to manage it. Raymond heard it from across the room. He had just ended the call. He was standing near the exit doors, holding his phone with the particular looseness of a man who has just finished something he shouldn't have been doing in the first place, and knows it. He looked toward the sound. He saw his daughter throw the beanbag overhead to a girl behind her, and the girl dive for it and catch it, and the whole chain erupt in noise. He saw children gathered around Poppy, not beside her, the way adults stand beside something they're managing, but with her, the way children stand when they're in the middle of something. He watched for a long moment without moving. He was a man who dealt in infrastructure, roads, bridges, systems, load-bearing capacity. He understood weight. And standing at the edge of his daughter's birthday party, watching a man he had never met redesign a children's game in 5 minutes so his daughter could play it, Raymond Whitmore felt the specific, precise weight of everything he had been getting wrong. It did not arrive as insight. It arrived as something older and quieter than insight. It arrived the way grief arrives, or love. Not as a thought, but as a recognition. After the game wound down and the cupcakes were eaten, and the children started drifting toward the tables in the loose, satisfied way of people who have spent good energy, Raymond crossed the gymnasium, to where Stuart was helping Finn clean chocolate, frosting off his left hand, with a paper napkin. He introduced himself. He was not by nature a man who struggled for words. His job required precision of language, and he'd developed it over years. But he found himself unusually uncertain about what to say. He stood there for a moment with his hands in his pockets, a tall man in a blue dress shirt, looking at a stranger who had done in 20 minutes what Raymond had not managed in 2 years. "I want to thank you," he said finally, "for what you did with the game. And for..." He started again. She looked happy. I haven't seen her look like that in a while. Stuart looked at him with the kind of directness that is not unkind but does not soften things unnecessarily. "She's a great kid," he said, "really sharp. She notices everything." "I know," Raymond said, and then, because something had shifted in him, and he was paying attention to it. I was on the phone. Stuart didn't say anything. I should not have been on the phone, Raymond said. Stuart nodded, not in the way of someone granting absolution, but in the way of someone acknowledging a true thing. Kids don't need perfection, he said. They need somebody looking at them. Raymond looked at him for a moment. That's it? That's most of it, Stuart said. Poppy rolled over to them. She had a cupcake in her lap, chocolate frosting, naturally, and a look of general satisfaction that Raymond hadn't seen on her face in longer than he wanted to count. She looked up at Stuart. Are you coming to the winter carnival at school? When is it? 2 weeks. There's a parade and a snow sculpture contest. Stuart glanced at Finn, who was vigorously nodding. I think we can probably manage that, he said. Poppy nodded as if this were settled, then she looked at her father. Dad, you have cupcake. He blinked, looked down. There was a smear of yellow frosting on the sleeve of his dress shirt. He had no idea how it got there. He looked up at Poppy, who was watching him, with the expression she'd inherited directly from Susan. A slight tilt of the head, one eyebrow fractionally higher than the other, the look of someone cataloging an absurdity for future reference. He laughed. Not a polished, social laugh. A real one, the kind that surprised him on the way out. Fair enough, he said. She handed him a napkin from her lap with the gravity of a surgeon presenting a scalpel. The weeks after Poppy's birthday were quieter, not dramatically, not all at once. Raymond did not have a sudden revelation that made everything simple. That is not how these things work, and anyone who tells you it is, has not had the things happen to them that would make them know better. What happened was incremental. Raymond left work at 5:30 on a Tuesday, just because. He ate dinner with Poppy at the kitchen table instead of in front of his laptop. She told him about a project Mr. Favreau had assigned. A research presentation on a Canadian province, and she'd chosen Manitoba because nobody else wanted it, and she liked having the original position. He asked her questions, she answered them. They stayed at the table for 40 minutes after the plates were cleared, just talking. And Raymond thought about how he used to do this with Susan, how it used to just be a thing that happened without him having to decide to do it. He started to decide to do it. He called Dr. Nwosu and rebooked the appointments he'd cancelled over the previous year. He told him, in the first session back, about the birthday party, about the phone call, about the man who had reorganized the relay race. Dr. Nwosu listened. He did not say I told you so, which was one of the things Raymond appreciated about him. He said, what did you take from it? Raymond thought about this. That I've been solving for the wrong variables, he said. Dr. Nwosu smiled. You're the only client I have who expresses emotional insight in engineering terms. Is that bad? No, he said. It means you understand it. Now let's talk about what you do with it. Stuart, true to his word, brought Finn to the winter carnival at Hillcrest Elementary. The snow sculpture contest was the centerpiece, and Poppy had recruited Stuart, on the basis of his professional experience with fine motor planning, which she presented as qualification, to help with their entry. They built a whale. It was not a technically accomplished whale. The tail was too short, and the fins were asymmetrical, and at one point, the whole thing listed slightly to the left, and had to be reinforced with a hockey stick, borrowed from another family. But it was unmistakably a whale, and Poppy had named it Gerald, and Gerald won 3rd place in the elementary division, which came with a ribbon and a gift certificate to the bookstore on Bank Street. Poppy taped the ribbon to her bedroom wall, not near the other certificates and medals from before, the soccer tournament, the school choir, the swimming badge, but somewhere new, on a blank patch of wall that had been empty for a long time. The friendship between their families did not happen in a dramatic rush. It happened the way most real things happen, slowly, in the spaces between planned activities. Stuart would sometimes call Raymond, when he saw something at the rehabilitation center that he thought might be relevant to Poppy's care. A new adaptive equipment option, a recreational program starting up, a physiotherapy approach worth asking her team about. Raymond would sometimes text Stuart about something Finn had mentioned, a concern or a conflict. The kind of small thing a single parent notices, and doesn't always know what to do with. They were, in some ways, fluent in the same second language, the language of people making it up as they went, trying to give their children what they themselves were still learning to need. In March, Raymond did something that had been sitting on a mental list he'd never quite opened. He submitted a proposal to the city's recreation division, recommending updated design guidelines for community event spaces, specifically around ensuring that recreational programming at city-owned facilities actively incorporated adaptive and inclusive activity formats as a default, not an afterthought. He wrote it carefully, with the specificity his position allowed and the urgency the birthday party had given him. He cited research. He named numbers. The 22% of Canadians living with a disability, the consistent evidence that social inclusion had measurable impacts on mental health and development outcomes for children with mobility challenges. It was not a grand gesture. It was a policy memo. But Raymond had spent 20 years in municipal infrastructure, because he believed that the built environment shaped human experience in ways both visible and invisible, that a well-designed road, a properly graded sidewalk, a building with a ramp rather than stairs, changed the texture of daily life in ways too small to individually name, and too large to ignore. He believed the same was true of a children's game, of a party, of a gymnasium. The proposal was reviewed by the Recreation Committee in April, and adopted with minor amendments in June. It was not front-page news. It would not have meant anything to most people who walked past the Hintonburg Community Center on their way to the Saturday market. But somewhere in the filing system of the City of Ottawa, there was now a set of guidelines that said, in the clear and unambiguous language of municipal policy, every child gets to play. Raymond sat at his desk when the confirmation came through, and thought about a relay race and a beanbag, and his daughter laughing with her whole face. He picked up his phone, not to make a call. To check the time. It was 4:58. He shut down his computer at 4:59 and was home in time to make dinner, and when Poppy asked how his day was he told her. All of it, the policy memo, the amendment, the vote. She listened with the focused attention she gave to everything that interested her, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "So now other kids won't have to just sit there." "That's the idea," he said. She nodded, processing it. Then, "Gerald should get partial credit, the whale. He inspired the whole thing," she said. Raymond laughed. He set down his fork. He looked at his daughter. This child, who noticed everything, who made strong cases for chocolate frosting, who had carried 2 years of loss with a quietness that had broken his heart, without him fully letting himself see it until a stranger crouched down in a gymnasium and asked if a seat was taken. She was going to be all right, not unchanged, not unaffected. But all right, in the deeper sense of the word, the sense that means capable and connected and known. He was going to make sure of it, not by solving and providing and executing, but by something simpler and harder, by looking up,